Ancient Asini is located on the north shore of the Argolic Gulf, 1 kilometer to the east of the seaside resort of Tolo, and just 10 kilometers from the city of Nafplion. The rocky promontory called Kastraiki, or Paleocastro, was identified as the Asini of Homer in the 19th century. This view was accepted and further disseminated by Heinrich Schliemann, excavator of Mycenae and Troy, and an enthusiastic reader of Homeric epics. Asini sent ships to the Trojan War as a member of the Argive fleet under the command of King Diomedes. The morphology and location of the promontory in the Argolic Gulf contributed to its choice as a settlement site already from the 3rd millennium BC. At 52 meters high, 33 meters long, and 140 meters wide, and half surrounded by sea, Kastraiki, with its steep and rocky west and south face, is a naturally fortified location. At the same time, the protection from the west and north winds provided by the islet of Romvi on the west and Barbune Hill on the northwest created appropriate conditions for the safe anchorage of ships and the development of maritime trade. In the 1920s, Swedish archaeologists undertook an extensive excavation program, bringing to the surface an impressive and complex mosaic of successive settlement phases. Here is recorded the history of the area for more than 3,000 years. The impetus to start excavations was given by the heir to the Swedish throne, Gustav Adolf VI, who first visited the area in the autumn of 1920. He himself actively contributed to the project during the first period of excavation. Men and women from neighboring Tolo worked under the supervision of Swedish archaeologists. The men undertook the digging and soil removal work, while the women shoveled and washed ceramics. The first excavations were undertaken on the peak of Kastraiki Hill, which was called the Acropolis, its northwest side, or the lower town of the Swedish excavators, as well as on the peak and eastern flank of Barbune Hill. A recent study by the Swedish Institute has focused on the region to the east of the Acropolis and the southeastern flank of Barbuna. Data from the archaeological study, combined with ancient sources, sketch the course of human activity in ancient Asini. The first faint traces of human presence in the region belong to the 6th millennium BC, in the form of a few shards from the Neolithic period from Barbuna. During this period, Kastraiki was still a small rocky island, separated from the land by a narrow strip of sea. To the east, between the hill and Drepano, the sea extended approximately 700 meters further inland from the modern coastline, covering a large portion of the modern plain. Intense geomorphological upheavals over the next millennium resulted in the creation of a shallow lagoon at first, which gradually, with the deposition of sediment on its floor, transformed into a fertile plain towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC. At the same time, the small island united with the land, completing the formation of the region. During the early Bronze Age, in the 3rd millennium BC, important centers developed in Argolis, including Lerna and Tirins. The period is characterized by complex social organization and the development of metallurgy and technology. The inhabitants of the early Helladic settlement at Asini lived on the 2 flat areas of the Acropolis and in the lower town. Their houses were small, either four-sided or apsidal, with walls made of small stones and tiled roofs. Infants and children were buried in these same areas. Clay vessels, tools, seals and seal impressions come from the houses of the settlement. A number of objects bear witness to the contacts that Asini maintained with the contemporary early Helladic and early Minoan cultures developing in the Aegean. At the end of the 3rd millennium BC, upheavals in the Aegean and internal turbulence appear to have affected the evolutionary course of early Helladic civilization in mainland Greece. As a result, communities turned to an agricultural economy, and new customs made their appearance. From the Middle Helladic period in Argolis, the development of the settlement at Argos is important. The main section of the mid-Helladic settlement at Asini is located in the lower town. The gradual increase in population up to the end of the period led to the expansion of the settlement towards the foot of Barbouna. Its 380 to 500 residents were occupied with farming, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and the gathering of food. The foundations of their houses were made of stone, and the superstructure of unbaked brick. The buildings were straight and separated by narrow alleys and courtyards. The spatial arrangement of the settlement does not betray any kind of central plan or organization. Towards the end of the period, the houses of the lower town became larger in size, with more rooms and a more complex plan. A characteristic example is House B of the Swedish excavators, with 13 rooms and likely a second story, in which perhaps more than one family resided. The dead were placed in pots, pits, and cist graves. To the east of the Acropolis, in a plot of land today occupied by a campsite, the tombs were arranged inside and around a low circular stone tumulus. Its construction was the result of the communal decision and action of the members of one or more groups. The richest grave, with 16 vessels, a limestone sword pommel, and a bronze dagger, denotes the transition to the next phase, called the Late Helladic or Mycenaean period. The Mycenaean world flourished in Argolis. The palatial complexes of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Midea became symbols of a central authority, around which society was hierarchically arranged. In this system, Asini took advantage of its geographic location and developed due to its participation in maritime trade. The involvement of the harbour of Asini in a network of communication and goods exchange is indicated by the discovery of the shipwreck of a small boat a few miles to the south of Kastraiki. The ship was transporting cargo from Cyprus, Crete, and mainland Greece that dates to the late 13th century BC. The exotic objects and the large number of grave gifts in the chamber tombs of the Barbouna cemetery confirm the above. One of these, Tomb 1 of the Eastern Cemetery, contained 80 vessels, of which 45 are decorated and 33 are covered in tin, as well as a plethora of other objects made of gold, silver, bronze, lead, ivory, faience, and semi-precious stones. The corresponding settlement of the lower town is not particularly impressive in terms of its size and construction. It lacks imposing cyclopean walls, labyrinthine palaces, and specialized workshops. Only the so-called House G stands out, a complex of rooms with a central hippo-style hall, where, in addition to common functions, ritual use has also been determined. In conjunction with a built-in bench on one side of the hall, an assemblage was found that included intact vessels and figurines, a stone axe, and a jug without a base placed upside down. Among the figurines was the famous clay head known as the Lord of Asini. The initial opinion that it represented a male figure has been superseded. Intense activity throughout the proto-geometric and geometric period in Asini is shown by the discovery of assemblages of settlement, burial or ritual character in nearly all the locations excavated. Asini is one of the few settlements where the transition to the historic period is not marked by destruction, abandonment or other form of sudden interruption in habitation. At the beginning of the period, the main settlement was located in the area to the east of the Acropolis. Inhabitants repaired and reused the houses of the previous late Helladic 3C period, building stone foundations and walls of brick. In the 10th century BC, houses of apsidal plan appeared. Nevertheless, houses again acquired a rectangular shape from the late 8th century BC. Movable finds and installations associated with cult have been found on the Acropolis and Barbuna Hill. The peak of Barbuna Hill was shaped with an artificial plateau, where in the late 8th century, a rectangular building with a north-south orientation replaced an earlier apsidal construction. A large number of objects were found dating to the late 8th to early 5th century BC, on the terrace and in the interior of the building. The sanctuary was identified as that of Apollo Pytheos, mentioned by Pausanias. Today, only the base of a World War II anti-aircraft gun survives on the peak of the hill. Pausanias arrived in Asini in the 2nd century AD and found a desolate place. Describing the history of the city, he mentions that in around 700 BC, the residents abandoned the city when they were besieged by Argos in retaliation for their alliance with the Lacedaemonians. The Argives destroyed Asini and confiscated its land, but they spared the sanctuary of Apollo Pytheos. With the help of Sparta, the residents of Asini relocated to the western side of the Messinian Gulf, in the area of modern Koroni. According to Strabo, the first settlers of Asini were the Dryopes, an initially wild group active in the area of Phocis, north of Delphi, who were civilized and led to the Peloponnese by Hercules, following the orders of Apollo. Based on Pausanias' report regarding the abandonment of Asini and the lack of significant finds, the first excavators considered that Asini was re-inhabited in the late 4th century BC. However, recent excavations have shown that Asini in the intervening 4 centuries, although in decline, was not completely abandoned. At least 2 sanctuaries appear to have existed on the Acropolis at this time, dedicated to Demeter and Apollo, perhaps also to Artemis. In excavations to the east of the hill, sparse remains were discovered associated with a small installation dating to the period 500 to 225 BC. And additionally, a small number of cist graves date to the first half of the 5th century BC. The most impressive architectural remains from Asini belong to the Hellenistic period. The walls surrounding the Acropolis and the lower town, built in 300 BC. Their construction is associated with the presence of the ambitious and inventive Dimitrios Poliorkitis, son of Alexander the Great's general Antigonos I Monophthalmos. On the south side of the hill, where access from the sea is difficult, the walls are low, just 2.5 meters high. On the eastern and northern sides, however, strong walls and high towers were constructed. The tower protecting the eastern gate to the Acropolis is preserved to an impressive height of 9.5 meters. The variations in material and manner of construction, obvious at many points along the wall, mark the presence of subsequent conquerors of Asini. The settlement of Hellenistic Asini spread mainly over the lower town, where parts of houses have been found. Architectural remains and ceramic assemblages have been found on the Acropolis as well. Preserved here are sections of 2 presses, most likely for the production of wine. The installations, of which the non-moving part of the press and small reservoirs are preserved, confirm the agricultural occupation of the residents. Vessels, figurines, props for ceramic kilns, and molds for the construction of clay figurines, loom weights, illuminate just some moments in the daily lives of the residents of Asini. From their date, it appears that after 300 to 250 BC, Asini saw a second period of prosperity, in the second half of the 2nd century BC, perhaps due to the peaceful conditions prevailing in the Aegean at the time. Subterranean cisterns for collecting water met the needs of the inhabitants. One of these, with 3 chambers holding a volume of 23 cubic meters, was built in the southeastern section of the lower town. Preserved are its mouth and the settling basin, with a pebble floor for collecting sludge. On the surface, next to the mouth, a rectangular basin was built. Our knowledge regarding the later history of Asini is fragmentary. In the early 1st century AD, Strabo notes that Asini was a small village. Pausanias, a century later, saw only ruins. At the end of the 4th or beginning of the 5th century AD, 2 small baths were built, excavated during the first excavations at the site. One is preserved today in good condition in the eastern section of the lower town, next to the annexes of the Church of the Dormition of the Virgin. The locker and the cold bathrooms, with 2 small apsidal bathtubs for personal use, are visible to the north. The rooms of the tepid and hot bath, also with 2 individual bathtubs, are located to the south. Beneath the floor of the southernmost hall is the hypocaust, the subterranean space through which hot air circulated to heat the room above. The region again came to the fore in the late 17th century AD, when the Venetian fleet landed at Tolo in 1686 under the command of Admiral Morosini, before he began his campaign to recapture Nafplion from the Ottomans. During the Second Venetian period, up to 1715, the Venetians fortified the islets in the bay and reinforced the Hellenistic walls of Castraici. The Swedish excavations undertaken in the 1920s served to turn the attention of the international scientific community to Asini. Unfortunately, the next involvement of the region in European affairs was not due to new scientific interest, but rather to the war that definitively affected the flow of human history. During the Second World War, Asini was chosen once again for its strategic location as the site for the installation of the Italian occupation forces. The Axis powers, fearing a potential landing of the Allies on the beaches of Tolo and Plaka in Drepano, installed the 433rd Mechanized Battalion of the Piedmont Infantry Division in the area. Upon their installation, the Italian forces conscripted a local workforce and quickly proceeded to make extensive interventions to the hill. Their aim was to transform the hill into a modern fortress. Thus, they built single-spaced auxiliary structures, machine gun bases, outposts and watchtowers, opened the ancient cisterns to store materials and ammunition, built stone stairs and pathways, and linked all of the above with a dense network of trenches. As material for their construction, they used the readily available stone from the ancient structures that had just recently been brought to light. This resulted in the destruction of an extremely significant portion of the antiquities on Castraici, mainly in the lower town, and the complete destruction of the remains on the peak of Barbuna Hill. Just before the destruction, George Seferis wandered over the hill of Asini, seeking its forgotten king. In the poem The King of Asini, he wondered about the futility of glory and the ephemeral nature of human existence. The ancient remains and the single word mention of Asini in Homer would become the symbols of a lost world.